Hello, I'm Michael Petrono, and I'm your instructor for our course. And we're going to be working through the textbook Macroeconomy today, the 16th edition by Schiller and Gebhardt. And this will be the main focus of our course. So this will be the material that you'll be studying from. So I will be doing lecture slides on everything that we're going to cover in the book. But of course, you need to read the book yourself as well, because I can't possibly cover literally every single point. But we will be going through the PowerPoints that will give you a really good, solid understanding of what is in these chapters. And so thereafter that, please go ahead and study the material yourself, and we'll be having quizzes every week in order to make sure that you're keeping up. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So what is the chapter all about? Well, this particular chapter is going to be discussing economics to understand how individuals and businesses make economic decisions, to determine how markets shape economic outcomes, to examine the role that government can and does play in reshaping economic performance, and to understand how we ourselves can make better economic decisions. So all of this together is essentially what economics is all about. Let's take a look at some core issues of economics. So, according to the slide, we live in a world of limited resources. And so that forces every nation to make a couple of decisions. And there's three main decisions that economists have focused on that every society, whether they're organized as a capitalist society, a socialist society, it really makes no difference. Every society has to figure out what is it going to produce from its limited resources. Since you can't have everything you want, you have to make choices as to what you're going to produce. I mean, do we decide to produce Mercedes level cars, or would it be better to have Hyundai level cars and then have money left over to provide golf courses for people? I mean, of course, I'm just randomly picking out examples, but every society has to make these decisions since there's going to be a trade-off. In order to have one thing, you have to give up something else, and that's because of scarcity. And we'll talk about scarcity in more detail on another slide. So anyway, every society has to figure this out. The next thing every society has to do is they have to figure out how to produce the good and the services that we select. There are multiple ways to produce any particular good or a service. Let me give you a simple example. We're going to produce tomatoes. Now, tomatoes can be produced on a 500-acre farm using industrial methods, meaning large mechanical tractors powered by diesel fuel, application of fertilizers produced from petrochemicals, application of pesticides produced again from petrochemicals, and all done on an industrial scale. That's one way of doing it. That's the way we do it mostly in the United States. But another way you could do this would be to do it on a 5-acre family farm that's all natural. No petrochemical fertilizers. We use cow manure, for instance, to fertilize the soil. No pesticides, everything is done naturally. That would be another way to produce tomatoes. Now there's good and bad to both production methods. The industrial method provides tomatoes at incredibly low cost. The natural method, of course, would be significantly more expensive because it's not using machinery, but it would be all natural. So how are we going to do this? Who makes the decision as to how those tomatoes get produced? Now, of course, that's also true now for every other good that we're talking about, producing houses, producing cars, producing whatever it is that we're discussing. We need to make a decision how we're going to produce them, and there's a variety of ways that we could do that. Then last but not least, the most contentious of all of them, for whom should the goods and services be produced? In other words, who should get them? Now, of course, that's similar to, and maybe even can be subsumed under the rubric of who gets the income. Because if you have the income, then you get the goods and services, don't you? And as you all know, fighting over income distribution is always, in every society, highly contentious. And some societies are very unequal, and a certain degree of inequality seems to be necessary in order to provide incentives. For instance, you all are studying way beyond the level of high school. If there was no better job that produced higher income, how many of you all would continue going to school to the level that you've done now if your income was going to be exactly the same as someone who just simply stopped at high school? Well, I think you all recognize very quickly that very few of us love this school so much that we would continue going if there was no reward at the end. So unequal incomes are necessary to get people to do difficult things. And so we need some degree of inequality, but how much inequality do we need? And that is a discussion that every society has to get involved with through its political process. And of course, that also impacts things such as what are the tax rates? Should the rich pay higher tax rates than the poor? How much higher tax rates should they pay? Should all taxes be the same? Those questions all now are subsumed under point number 3. As you can see, every economic system has to answer a great variety of questions, all of which can be quite contentious. And then last point on this issue is the economy is us, is the title of this particular slide. So when we talk about the economy, we're talking about all the production and consumption activities for the entire society. So the economy would be the collective behavior for the United States of the 340 million people who live in it. And of course, for other countries, then they would be, the same thing would be true for them as well. Now, I mentioned scarcity a while back. Let's go ahead and think about scarcity for a minute to see the kinds of issues that it generates. Because scarcity is one of the core problems of all economic systems, not just capitalist systems. Scarcity is an issue of all systems. So first of all, let's go through the definition and figure out, what does scarcity even mean? Scarcity is the lack of enough resources to satisfy all the desired uses of those resources. And to make it even further, if the price was zero, okay? So if everything was free, would there be enough of it to satisfy all people's desires? I think we already know the answer to that question. It is no. Unfortunately, the amount of resources we have on the planet are not anywhere near enough to satisfy everyone's resources, everyone's desires. So because of that, someone has to go without having the resource, right? And I can give you an example that's happening to me right now. I'd like to have a nice new Mercedes, but I don't have one. My wants have been unfulfilled. But I've seen, on the interstate, I've seen other people who are driving those Mercedes, so apparently their wants have been fulfilled. So why are my wants being unfulfilled? Whose wants should be unfulfilled? Well, therein lies the final problem we're going to discuss here, that scarcity requires that economic choices be made. And that means someone has to decide, does Mr. Petrano get a Mercedes or does he not get a Mercedes? Who will make that decision? How will that decision be made? Of course, that is the whole crux of this whole point. I want you all to recognize this will be true in every single society. In a capitalist society, this is made by one mechanism. In a socialist society, it's made by a different mechanism. But whether you are socialist or capitalist, the decision has to be made, because both in socialist societies and in capitalist societies, scarcity exists because there's not enough for everyone to have everything they want. Someone has to be denied access to a particular good. So the mechanism we're going to use is what economics is going to be focusing on. And of course, in capitalist societies, which will be throughout most of this class, we'll be mostly studying the capitalist mechanism, but also governmental mechanisms that modify the capitalist mechanism. But this course is particularly about capitalist systems where we have profit-making businesses and individuals buy and sell what they choose to sell. That is what we're going to be mostly discussing. So we'll be discussing all of these questions as to who will make the decision, whose wants will go unfulfilled, will all be made within the context of a capitalist system.